Hello and welcome back to Geek and Speak, the Geek and Seek podcast. Today, we are going to be starting a new episode in a probably, I think, 5-part series where we're going to be looking at the top 100 commanders according to EDHREC and throwing them into an internet-friendly tier list. Joining with me today is our good friend Preston. Preston, how's it going, man?
Going pretty good.
Like to hear it. And we also have the man, the myth, the legend, Jason. How's it going?
Going fantastic. In other than magic stuff, Ohio State lost. You'll see this after that happened, but oh my God, I'm so happy that they lost. Let's go.
Cool, sports ball, my guy, and I am your host Morgan. I actually went to one of the Royals series games against the Yankees. That was the first sports ball event I had been to since I was in high school. So yeah, there you go, Jason. I did it. I did the sports ball. If you
Maybe you being there is why they lost.
That's actually probably true because I've been to several Royals games before in my life, and I've never been to one where they won. So it's obviously me. I am the problem.
Wow, really?
Yeah, yeah,
Maybe if they had one, you'd like sports more.
maybe. If you would like to support the show, you could do all of the YouTube algorithm things, such as liking the video, leaving comments, checking out our other videos, being subscribed if you're not already. And if you want to go the extra mile, you can head over to patreon.com/geekandseek YouTube. And you can also find a link to our Discord in the description of this video if you would like to hang out, talk magic, keep the conversation going. Quick disclaimer before we hop into this, I should also say, is that because we are spreading this series out over the course of probably a couple months, we're not going to do this back to back to back for every episode. We might have another topic we want to hit while we're going through this series. It's possible that the top 100 list, according to EDHREC, will slightly change over time, but it should be about the same because we'll get through it quick enough. We're looking at the top 100 from the last 2 years, so new commanders shouldn't be coming in that often, or at least very high on the list. So hopefully that even though it's going to take us probably a month or two to get through this, this should be a pretty good representation of what the top 100 on EDHREC is. And our criteria is, yes, a little bit of power, but if it's in the top 100, you can assume it's at least semi-powerful. So we were more thinking of, is it a cool design? Does it support a cool theme? Does it seem fun to play? Is it fun to play against? We're thinking of more along those lines than specifically power. But with that all said, Preston, do you want to start us off with Commander number 100?
Yeah, I'll get us started. So first up, we have Joda, Archmage Eternal. One blue, red, and white for a 4/3 legendary creature human wizard with flying. You may play one of each color rather than pay the mana cost of spells you cast. So let's see. We got an average of B. I rated it C. You guys both rated it B.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and slap that right into B. Nice, healthy middle ground to start off the tier list. So this was actually Steven's first commander deck, sort of, kind of. And as a result, it's kind of a boogeyman in our early days of our play group because you would cheat in, Emrakul the Promised End and these giant green stompy creatures and stuff like that. But he doesn't play it that often, and you still have to, survive to have that mana. His mana base in that deck is kind of clunky, so it's not as scary as it used to be. But I do still kind of think of it as like a nostalgic boogeyman, even though it's maybe not as scary by today's standards.
I think that you can just build Joda in a lot of different ways. I mean, obviously you're kind of more aiming towards like casting really high cost spells because you get to cheat them in for only 5 mana and it's one of each color. But because like there's no like types or anything as far as like in its ability, you could just cast any spell. It really kind of gives you, an open like a blank canvas really. Because you could actually go creatures, you can go enchantments, you could go big artifacts, you could really do it any way you want. So I think because of that, like that's why I give it a B.
Yeah.
Preston,
I
you're a
rated
little
it a
lower
little
on
lower.
this. Yeah.
Yeah, I just put it a little lower because most of the list I've seen tend to be just kind of good, like good big stuff. which is fine, and I understand why they do that. I just find that a little boring. But I have seen an occasional Joda list that has a little extra spice to it, so I didn't go too low.
Yeah.
You can do fun stuff. I've just mostly seen the
See,
Emrakuls and
Yeah.
such.
I think that you might see it as a boring card design, but it actually leads to a lot of exciting games.
No, that's fair.
Yeah.
I
Uh,
don't hate it.
and notably, it's still cast, so all of your Eldrazi's and stuff still happen. Like a lot of these like cheat stuff into play, it's just like you'll still get your enters, but you don't get cast. Joda, you still get cast, so that's an extra layer of oh my god. But yeah, I can agree with Preston's reasoning. Jason, what do we got next on our list?
So next up we have Ivy, Gleeful Spell Thief. For a blue and a green, it's a 2/1 legendary creature fairy rogue with flying. And it says whenever a player casts a spell that targets only a single creature other than Ivy Gleeful Spell Thief, you may copy that spell. The copy targets Ivy. So this is kind of like Simic Feather, but I think it's slightly more fair Feather because you can't do anything with it with just itself on the battlefield. You have to have another creature in order to trigger it. But that being said, green and blue, it's not like you can't really make tokens in those colors very easily. Um, but I think this is really cool. I think for 2 mana, it's not like an overpowered creature as far as like its power and toughness. So for 2 mana, I think this is a really interesting commander to build, and I think that this could lead to some fun decks. But it's just it's a little too close to like Feather, and it's just it doesn't seem like the most exciting build because you really just want to do one specific thing. There's not many different routes that you can take this commander. But I still think it's fun. And Morgan, you and I gave it a B, and Preston, you gave it an A, which averages out to a B.
So I want to actually say this. You saying is kind of Simic Feather is actually, we're still going to have an average of a B, but I'm changing my answer to a C because we will eventually get to talking about Feather, I think. I think it's somewhere in the top 100. Feather is a much more interesting commander to me. And then in Simic, I think you're still playing those like weird cards that you won't necessarily play in other decks the same way with Feather, but it feels more fun and it feels more special in Boros than it does in Simic. And like you said, like Simic has the resilience, you're easily going to have the other bodies, and you're kind of just playing a lot of the generic Simic value stuff that you need to play just to get ahead and stuff, and that just makes it much less interesting. So I'm actually going to drop it to a C. I think the play pattern itself is perfectly fine. It's kind of interesting, but it's so much lower than Feather, and it probably plays semi-similarly, and it's also Simic. But Preston, you're high on it, so why are you high on it?
Well, first of all, I am a Feather player, so that has something to do with it. Being a sister to Feather obviously is going to make it pretty popular to me. But also, the big difference I think between this and Feather is the fact that it's also going to be affected by your opponent stuff. So every time you play a new game with Ivy, your opponent's decks can change how good she works. Because like if they're boosting their creatures with stuff, now you're also boosting Ivy. So you don't even have to have a secondary creature if they're doing stuff. So I think that's what makes it a little more, unique compared to Feather. I do like Feather more, but I still really like Ivy. I like any card that lets you sort of make a deck with cards that normally aren't as good in Commander.
Mm-hmm.
A new home.
Yeah, I suppose that's fair. Next up, we have Lightpaw's Emperor's Voice, which, if you are a longtime viewer of the channel, you've seen this in action. The first episode of Upkeep we ever filmed was actually the Voltron episode. I know that was like episode like 5 or 6 or something, but it was the first one we filmed. For 1 and a white, it's a 2/2 Fox Advisor. Whenever an aura enters the battlefield under your control, if you cast it, you may search your library for an aura card with mana value less than or equal to that aura and with a different name than each aura you control, which basically doesn't mean anything in Commander because it's a singleton format. And you put that card onto the battlefield attached to Lightpaw's Emperor Voice, then shuffle. This is a tutor commander, and I find that really annoying. It adds a lot of game time in shuffling, tutoring. You usually have the sequence figured out, like you usually know what your best auras are, but once you've done it a few times, then it takes even longer because you're like, oh, which one do I grab this time? And it's just insanely powerful at that too. There's a lot of very, very strong and efficient auras in mono white, and light pause coming down for 2 mana very early in the game. You're killing people with commander damage on turn 4, turn 5. I find it to be debatably the best Voltron-y style commander, but and I like that archetype. I think it's too strong, and I think it's annoying in play pattern. So I gave it a D. Jason also gave it a D. Preston gave it a B. I wonder why. So that's going to average to the bottom of C, I guess. But yeah.
It's just not fun to play against most of the time. It's really oppressive, and once you get even just 2 auras on light pause, a lot of the times it can just be the most impossible creature to remove at that point, and it's just not. It doesn't lead to fun and interesting games. It just. I am not a fan of light pause.
Yeah, Preston, you have a light pause deck though, so defend it.
Yeah, I knew I was gonna have to defend it coming into this, and I can't. It is as miserable to play against as you guys say, but man, I just love it so much. I know it objectively does deserve that D-ish, C-ish sort of grade, but I just have a lot of fun with it. It was like what, the second really good mono white commander after Shram.
For Voltron specifically, yeah. Yeah.
Mono white was struggling for a while. This was one of the first ones that really started to.
I mean, I feel like you got Macias. You got. I mean, you could.
You like Macias? That was not a really good one. That was fine. I'm talking about a good commander for mono white. This was like the second one.
So we have seen games where your light pause deck doesn't get to do its thing, but that's because it's like you run so few lands.
All 3
in the deck.
people teamed up.
Yeah, or
and
like
I got mana screwed.
Yeah, you run so few lands in the deck because your commander's only 2 mana. Your auras are cheap. So if we just kill your commander a couple times, then you might be locked out of the game. But that's not fun either. I know that's objectively how you play against Voltron, but it's just kind of lame for everyone when your deck is just not doing anything. In an ideal game of Commander, everyone's deck kind of does a little bit of their thing, but then ultimately someone has to win, right? But it's very bummy, far beyond what the average, I think, Voltron deck is. So that's another notch against it.
Yeah. I don't recommend anyone who hasn't built one yet to build one in the future. I can't do that in good conscience. I bust mine out maybe 2-3 times a year.
Yeah. But let's carry on. Here's one that we do find more interesting. Preston, do you want to tell us about what's next?
Yeah, so next up we have Ramos Dragon Engine for 6 colorless. Legendary artifact creature dragon, 4/4 with flying. Whenever you cast a spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on Ramos for each of that spell's colors. And then you can remove 5 +1/+1 counters from Ramos, and you add 2 of each color to your mana pool. Activate this ability only once each turn. So let's see. We all gave it an A. So
yippee! It's beautiful. He belongs up there.
It's just a really interesting build. It has a very powerful ability on it, and it somewhat feels a bit balanced at 6 mana, but it's just fun. One thing that I've thought about building this deck just to do is to get the oh gosh, what is it? The tree. I can't remember the name of it.
The World Tree?
Yeah, do the World Tree ability. I would love to get that off at some point in my life.
I like it that you could build it in basically however you want. It could be a 5-color good stuff commander. It could be a dragon commander. I mean, it comes from the dragon precon from 2017. And you could even do what I did, with my Ramos deck that I had for a couple years, which is you do like multicolor spells, just as many of those as you can. Specifically, I was playing a bunch of like commands and charms and stuff like that. And that way you're getting the +1/+1 counters very fast. And then you're killing people with commander damage. And then because it says you can remove the counters once each turn to add that mana, that means since a lot of the charms and commands are instants, that you can just keep going and do it on other people's turns as well. It was so fun. It's cool. It's just there's a lot of things you can do with it.
Ramos does technically push you to a certain thing, but I overall think it's probably the most interesting 5-color commander. Because like it does have something it obviously wants to do, but there's so many options for that archetype. Like with Slivers, you're doing Slivers. With Dragon, you're doing Dragon. Like whatever you can afford and whatever's best for your budget is what you're gonna do. Ramos can genuinely go in a bunch of different ways that are all in that multicolor like pocket.
Hmm. Yeah. Jason, do you want to lead us through the next card?
All right, so next up we have Veyron, Voice of Duality. It is a Efreet wizard. Oh, hey, sure. It's a 2/2 for 1 red, 1 blue, and 1, and it has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, Veyron, Voice of Duality gets +1/+1 until end of turn. And then it says if you casting or copying an instant or sorcery spell causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So to start off, we all gave this. So Preston and I gave it a C, and Morgan gave it a D, which averages out to a C. This is a good commander, like in a vacuum, you know. But looking at it from the aspects, like from everything that is involved in a commander game, this is just one of those ones that's going to lead to really, really long turns just on accident. Like it's going to slip and fall and take a 15-minute turn just because it has 3 different things that trigger, and they're going to trigger twice because it's just... Here's the other thing. It is triggered by its own ability. So, like... Every time you cast or copy one, it doesn't just get +1/+1, it gets +2/+2. But like, man, casting something like a Mizzix Mastery, oh my gosh, that's just gonna make
Trying to resolve that?
horrible. They did it in game nights, and I think they said it took like an hour or so. I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. So Josh did that on the Strixhaven episode, and I think he spent about an hour trying to set it up, realized he was nowhere near done. They took their lunch break while recording. While everyone else was at lunch, he stayed behind to start thinking through his turn. When everyone came back from lunch, it took about another hour to actually finish resolving it. And that is about what you can expect every single time you play this. And look, Spellslinger is not my favorite archetype, but there are Spellslinger commanders that I have been tempted to build before that seem interesting, that maybe have an interesting twist. And I will say that Veyron is very powerful. It's very strong. It can lead to these crazy turns. And if you like that kind of thing, I could see why you would maybe be tempted to build this. But it's a bit much. Anything to add, Preston, or does that sum it up pretty good?
I mean, yeah, you guys mostly got it. I didn't go a D with it like you did because at least with the commander, you are buffing it up while you're doing all your nonsense. So
Maybe
you have a win
someone.
con ready to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not just, having a 2.5-hour turn that doesn't do anything like some spell slinger decks sometimes do. But yeah, it's just
I think the
I'm
point
not
is
interested
though,
in it.
avoid 2.5-hour turns at all costs. Your individual turn should not take 2.5 hours. I don't care. That's a whole game.
Yeah. Next up, we have Ulalek fused Atrocity. So this is actually semi-new. This is from Modern Horizons 3. For 5 colorless or 1 of each color. It's a Eldrazi 2/5 with Devoid. Whenever you cast an Eldrazi spell, you may pay Colorless, colorless. If you do, copy all spells you control, then copy all other activated and triggered abilities you control. You may choose new targets for the copies. So this is kind of cool in the idea that it's finally a 5-color Eldrazi commander that actually cares about it. Like, I know we had Morophon or whatever, so that's the idea. Is it's supposed to fill that role? But the problem is in practice, what you're doing is you're just like doubling your Annihilator triggers and stuff with your Eldrazi, and that is miserable. If there's anything that casual players hate, it's having their lands blown up. And do you know what happens very quickly once you start doubling Annihilator triggers? People lose their lands. So this is not very fun at the casual levels. So Jason and I gave this a C, and Preston gave it a D. What else do you guys got to say about this stupid monstrosity?
All right, I think that it's not like it's a perfect 5-color Eldrazi commander. Like if like they were ever gonna print an Eldrazi commander that was going to be 5 colors, like this seems fine for that. Outside of that, you don't really do anything with it. Like, you have to play Eldrazi's for this to actually be a good deck. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I gave it a C. But the fact that it is the first 5-color Eldrazi commander, which is something that like play style has never had outside of like a commander that wasn't an Eldrazi or cared about Eldrazi at all. I think that's pretty cool that they did that, give a certain type of player something that they haven't had before, and that's cool. That does make games more interesting and things like that. But after a while, like it's just Eldrazi's. Like, it's not the most interesting thing in the world. It's just Eldrazi's.
Yeah. Oh, I was gonna say first, Eldrazi's are definitely one of those creature types where the good ones are miserable to play against, and the ones that aren't good are basically useless.
Mm-hmm.
So your deck is either going to do nothing, or it's going to be awful to play against. And I put it at a D instead of a C like you two because it just annoys me that these two huge colorless monstrosity fused into a 5-color 2/5. I just don't get it.
That is
Doesn't
kind
make
of
any
odd.
sense.
Yeah, so we'll put this sucker here and C. Next up, we have Finn the Fangbearer, which is for 1 and a green. It's a human warrior 1/3 with Death Touch. Whenever a creature you control with Death Touch deals combat damage to a player, that player gets 2 poison counters. So Jason gave it an A, maybe because he has a Finn deck. Preston gave it a B, and I said low A, high B. I decided to go down and average the sucker out to a B. I'll get into why, but the general consensus is that we're moderately high on this little guy. Jason, why don't you start off since you have a Finn deck?
Okay, so I think that you okay, if people think that this is like an infect deck 100% of the time, I mean, kind of in a way. See, here's the thing about it. My Finn deck, it doesn't go super hard on poison counters. It just goes super hard on Death Touch. And then I have a secret Ent army in that. And most of the Ents, actually I'm pretty sure all of them, don't have Death Touch. I can give them Death Touch with certain things that I have, but it's not like the most optimized Finn deck. So I did give it an A on like a more personal bias thing, but I do think that it is an interesting commander to build. Death Touch Tribal is pretty cool, and it's mono green, so it's pretty limited to what you can do with it. So it's not going to be necessarily the strongest deck at the table every single game. Because you're in green, you can ramp and you can start playing the spells in your hand sooner, and there are plenty of give target creature Death Touch spells that you can do, and just a lot of really 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 cheap Death Touchers. So if you have the ability to make them unblockable or something, now you can actually start killing people pretty quick, just because they're getting poison counters. But honestly, it's a really fun deck to play, and I don't know many people that have built a Finn deck, and I've never played against another one. So
I have, and I think your Entish sub theme is the minority. I think most Finn decks are not that. I I think most of them are playing a bunch of the low mana, like, a lot of sets recently have had like a 1 mana 1/1 with Death Touch, just a decent little guy for limited. That's busted if you're making contact with Finn. And there are, things that you can do to make your creatures unblockable or whatever. So I think I think it's cool. I like that you could play with that archetype because I think it's in a way it's kind of like the feather thing that we were saying earlier, where you're giving these cards that you probably wouldn't necessarily play. You're giving them a home, and that's kind of nice. I think a lot of the Death Toucher creatures are understated, underperformers, maybe not the right creature type. So then they just don't get played as much. So it's nice to give them a home. The problem is twofold. One is a design problem, which is that a lot of the good Death Touch creatures are also in black. So the fact that this is not Golgari is a bit of a bummer. There's Grave Titan, there's Gonti, Sheoldred the Apocalypse, the Gitrog monster, Glissa Sunslayer. There's tons of black or Golgari creatures that have Death Touch that it would be nice to play in here. The other thing is a gameplay thing, which is that casuals get very scared when they see poison. They get very, very scared. I don't think they necessarily need to be. I think it's relatively fair. I think in certain ways it could maybe be above average, but I think it's relatively fair. But just a casual sees that and they're going to freak out. But with that said, I do actually still like the commander in that it gives you your cards that you wouldn't necessarily play otherwise a new home.
My thing also about it is, like, if you're going hard on Death Touch, once you get Finn off the table, these Death Touchers aren't really much more than that. Like, Finn is the problem. If the Death Touchers hit you while Finn is on the board, you get poison counters. If the Death Touchers hit you when Finn is not on the board, you just take damage. Also, giving your creatures trample is really, really powerful in this deck. If you're able to build the creature's toughness or power up with Death Touch trample is super, super good.
Yeah, so I gave it a B because we do play with Jason's version of the deck. If we played with a regular version of the deck, I'd probably be closer to the C to D range. If you play with the actual good versions of Finn, this is an F tier commander. This is miserable when people build it right. Because you don't use the 1/1 Death Touchers. That's not the actual good version of Finn. The good version of Finn makes like a million regular 1/1s and then goes and gets Bow of Nylea. That's what the good version of a Finn deck does. Because there's just nothing you can do against that.
Mm-hmm.
And if they need to, they can just proliferate with the couple green proliferate effects that they have.
True.
That's
True.
like the actual good version of Finn, and that's miserable. I've watched that in a couple videos before, and I'm just glad Jason didn't decide to do that.
Well, Preston, moving on to one that I think we're a little bit higher on. What do we got next?
All right. Next up, we have Sephris of the Hidden Ways. For a white, a blue, and a black, it's a 2/3 legendary creature human wizard. Whenever one or more creature cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, you venture into the dungeon. This ability triggers only once each turn. And then it has Create Undead. Whenever you complete a dungeon, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And you and me gave it a B, Morgan, and then Jason gave it an A for an average of B.
I should say that I don't necessarily think that this is good. I think it's pretty mid, but it's really cool. Like, I think the dungeon is an interesting mechanic that I hope that they find at least a couple more excuses to do. Maybe buff up the ceiling of this. There are a couple combos, like there are a couple loops that you can set up where you can infinitely dig through dungeons and ping people and stuff like that. But for the most part, it's fairly undersupported. So I would like to see dungeons get a little bit more love because it's just kind of fun. It's just kind of cool, and it's a neat design space. But I think it's relatively fair. I actually think it's pretty cool though.
As far as a dungeons commander goes, this is pretty good. This is pretty great. I think that, for a set that introduced dungeons, this was like the perfect commander to build for that. Whenever they introduce a new mechanic, it's good that mechanic gets a lot of support. Otherwise, nobody's going to play it. Think about what happened with energy counters. When energy first came out, like there wasn't enough support for it to actually be good. I know, like, wasn't there like standard energy was pretty good or something like that?
Yeah, but also when Kaladesh came out, Commander was not the top format, so they weren't even thinking about that. Maybe there would be a better energy commander back then if that were the case, but
yeah. And now there's plenty of energy cards, but I also think that just means that Sephiroth is going to get better as time goes on because they're probably going to provide more support to dungeons over the years. I mean, if they never addressed any type of dungeon stuff ever again, I really think it would be the waste of a pretty cool and interesting mechanic. Because whether you like it or not, dungeons is an interesting mechanic.
Yeah, I mean, it does a pretty normal thing for this color combo, which is filling up your graveyard with creatures and getting them back out. But this is a much more fair and interesting roundabout way of doing it, rather than just pay 1 black to reanimate something after you mill 30 cards.
right.
So I do like that. Take something that people like doing, just make it a little more interesting. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, for sure. Jason, what do we got next up on the list?
So next up, we have Narset Enlightened Exile. For 1 red, a white, and a blue, and 1, it is a 3/4 human monk that has creatures you control have prowess. And whenever Narset Enlightened Exile attacks, exile target non-creature, non-land card with a mana value lesser than Narset's power from a graveyard and copy it. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. Nowhere near as powerful as OG Narset, but I do think that it's interesting that it kind of mixes creature-based and spell-slinger decks. I think that's a bit interesting, and it really opens up to the deck building possibilities with this. And we actually all gave it an A across the board.
Yippee! The question is does it go below or above Ramos? That's the real question.
Mm-hmm.
I vote it goes below
below.
Ramos. Yeah, I vote it goes below.
See, I would say it's a bit more interesting, and at 4 mana, it's a little bit easier to cast, so it's a little easier to get going. So I would say it's better than Ramos, but I am outnumbered here.
So I said a couple minutes ago that there are Spellslinger commanders I've thought about building. This is it. I bought an etched foil Narset, like pre-ordered it because I was so excited about this card. I've almost built it multiple times, and the thing that keeps pulling me back is I think in practice it's actually probably very complicated because you're gonna have to start keeping track of all those prowesses. And here's how I think you get around it. Jason said, "Oh, you play some creatures. You're also playing Spellslinger." No. You play a bunch of instants and sorceries that make tokens. That's what you do. You do that, and I think that makes the deck stronger, but then you have to keep you have different prowess numbers for all your different creatures because you're making them at different times and stuff. And I feel like that will get very, very hard to track. So this is very cool. I like the cards that it lets you play with, all that. I still might build it someday, but as is, it does seem fairly complicated. But I do want to build it. It's cool.
Well, one thing you can do is you don't have to just do Spellslinger because it's any non-creature, non-land.
Right.
So you can also take advantage of the artifacts and enchantments. So like use those instants and sorceries to make all the token creatures, and then get something like an Anthem effect out with Narset's ability. That's something you can do to make it a little simpler and still keep that strength up.
Next up, we got a weird one. This is Mr. House, President and CEO. Mardu, so red, white, black. It's a 0/4 artifact human. Okay. Whenever you roll a 4 or higher, create a 3/3 colorless robot artifact creature token. If you roll 6 or higher, instead create that token and a treasure token. And then you can pay for, tap it, roll a 6-sided dice, plus an additional 6-sided dice for each mana from treasure spent to activate this ability. So it's kind of an artifact token deck, but it's also heavy on dice rolling. Notably, a lot of the D&D cards that care about dice rolling care about rolling D20s. So that would, if you play a lot of those cards, then you're able to hit the 4 or higher and your 6 or higher a lot more often than if you're just activating Mr. House and rolling a D6. So that's something you can keep in mind. But otherwise, it's mostly just a token artifact deck. But I think this thing is kind of a piece of poop. I think it's a C. I think it's probably plays really, really clunky. But that's just a me problem because Jason has it as an average B, and then Preston's high on it with an A. Discuss.
Yeah, I like taking advantage of the fact that you can roll the D20s. Like I just think dice rolling is kind of fun, and this like is probably the best dice roller, I would imagine, off the top of my head. I think there's a couple, but yeah, you get to make a token army, you get to make treasures. It's a good time.
See, this card really, really makes me wish that they would just make Krark's Other Thumb a legal card to play with. You know what Krark's Other Thumb does?
That's the it's like Krark's Thumb, except it cares about rolling dice instead of flipping coins.
And it's from one of the unsets, so it's not a legal card. But I think that like that, it's fine. Like now that dice rolling is actually a thing, I think that Krark's Other Thumb in Commander would be fine. Let it happen. This is fun. It's a cool card. I just think it's fun. It's a Fallout commander, so you can have fun with that aspect of it. It's not really that versatile. It's an interesting color combination, I think, for what this is doing. But man, it seems fun.
Yeah, fair enough. So this sucker is going to go in about mid B, I guess. And then Preston, what do we got next?
All right, next up we have Marrow Nar. For 3 and 2 black, it's a 2/3 rat rogue. All rats have fear, and you can tap it, sacrifice a rat, put X 1/1 black rat creature tokens into play where X is the number of rats you control. Let's see. You have it in an A, me and Jason have it at C.
So why are you guys low on it? I guess is what I would think is the more interesting take.
Rats are good, but it's rats. I'm not impressed by rats. This does what Kranko does. It doesn't like do anything with the goblins, but it does what Kranko does. So I mean, it's rats. I'm not afraid of rats.
Yeah,
That's
rats are
fair.
like they do have strength, but they're just so boring to me. Like the first time I saw a rat deck, I liked it, but then I realized there are like 20,000 rat decks out there on the internet and they are all exactly the same.
Every single one of these dies to Elish Norn immediately.
Oh, I guess that's true.
Also, like you could theoretically just toxic deluge, pay 1 life, kill 15 or 30 creatures.
So I'm gonna drop mine down to a B because now in my memory there are actually other rat commanders that are debatably better. Like there are other, like in more recent time, rat commanders that are debatably better than Maronar. However, the
Bluebro
reason
got a lot of help for rats.
did it? Okay. Well, what I was going to say is I actually just like sacrifice decks, and I feel like that you're playing a lot of those things. Like in this deck, yes, you're playing your rat colonies or whatever, your value rats and stuff, and you want to sacrifice them, make more rats, but you are also kind of a sacrifice deck or some kind of, maybe this is a skull clamp deck, and you're also gain your value off of when things die. When a thing dies, your blood artist effects, right? You gain life, your opponents lose a life. You play those kind of cards, and I like those kind of decks. So I actually am relatively high on this, but I'll drop it down to a B just because I think that you could probably say the same argument for other rat commanders, and I think that there are some other rat commanders that are maybe a little bit better. So yeah, we'll go ahead and slap this sucker down here in C. All right, Jason, what do we got next?
Next up, we have Turgid, God of Fright. So this is a modal dual face commander. On the one side, on the less interesting side, it's Turgid's Lantern, and it says tap. Target player loses 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. And then it has 3 and a black, and you can untap Turgid's Lantern. So there are ways to make infinite mana in black. So theoretically, you could just make somebody lose all their life that way, or they sacrifice all their stuff, discard all the cards in their hand, just win the game. That's the less interesting side. The more interesting side is Turgid, God of Fright, and it's a legendary creature god for 2 black and 3. It has menace, and it says whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, you may put that card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. I hate this card. I hate it. I absolutely, positively hate this card. It's just not fun to play against. It's not fun. It's not a good. It's not a fun commit. Why did they do this? It gives me a stroke every time I think about this card, because I'm just like, you just want people to lose friends? Is that why you designed this card? You're just like, man, I really wish that there was a way that I could have random strangers lose every single friend that they have. What if, Turgid? I think this card is absolutely gross.
Yeah, so you have it as an F. Preston has it as a D. I have it as a C. I think you had it flipped on which side was interesting and not. I think the front side, Turgid, God of Fright, is awful. It's because, casual players, they don't want to sacrifice their stuff, but they're sacrifice decks. It happens. They'll get over it. But they don't want to discard their cards. And even more so, when they're sacrificing and discarding their cards, they don't want you to have them. They want to play their own deck, God damn it. And this leads to just really painful play experiences. I actually had a Turgid deck. I played one game with it and realized that this was not the fit for our play group, so I immediately took it apart. I think the backside is more interesting because it really does get to the point where it's just a combo deck. If you play around the Lantern, it just becomes a combo deck. And yeah, some people don't like combo decks, but if they sit down and it feels right for the table, then it's fine. There are points at which you can interact, and at least if you get the combo and you get to activate it infinite times, then at least the game just ends. Whereas on the front side, you're just going to steal everyone's crap and you're just going to have to play it out because who knows what's going to happen. So I actually have played Turgid in the 99 of a deck before, and I felt like it wasn't ridiculously oppressive there. It was just kind of a value piece. But as a commander, it's awful. It's absolutely egregious.
See, my thing is with some of the modal dual face cards, one side is miserable, but if you actually did if you did build around the other side, I'd kind of respect it. But the Lantern is still terrible. It's still the same deck. It's still a sacrifice deck. It's just, not quite as oppressive as the front side, but it's still not going to be fun to play against.
I don't think. Not quite as oppressive. It's nowhere near as oppressive. Because here's the thing. First of all, you have to tap it, and then you have to have 4 mana to untap it, and then you tap it again, and they could just lose 3 life. You just lose 6 life. That's not the worst if you want to keep all your stuff.
Yeah, you actually have to create infinite mana in order for it to be. I actually have seen that before. Phil on Commander Clash did a deck where he built around the backside of Turgid. The rule was he could not cast the front side of it, and that was a nice restriction. If you really do that, then I think that's better. But it's still rough. So this sucker is going to be our first D. But next up, we have one that is everyone else really likes. This is Alayla Cutting Conqueror. So this is the backup commander from the Fairy Precon from Wilds of Eldraine. For 2, a blue, and a black, it's a 2/4 Fairy Warlock with flying. Whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, you create a 1/1 Black Fairy Rogue creature token with flying. And then whenever one or more fairies you control deals combat damage to a player, goad target creature that player controls. I really like this card. I mean, you could just kind of play it in a fairy deck, and I think you'd probably do play it in a fairy deck for just a little bit of value. But if you play around it as the commander, I think the stronger thing to do with it is you just play a bunch of instant speed cantrips and card draw and, just little interaction pieces, counter spell, stuff like that. That way you're casting spells on other players' turns and you're making these little fairies that you can now goad other people's stuff with. And goading is just really fun. It makes the game more interesting, keeps things moving, creates funny scenarios, stuff like that. And then you can skull clamp them when you're done. So you can draw more cards that you can cast during other people's turns. It's just really cool. We all gave this sucker an A.
Yeah, I think that this is a cool commander for all the reasons that you said, but one thing that you guys should know about me at this point is I love the flavor in cards. I think that the flavor in this card design is absolutely perfect. So, I mean, it's a Layla Cunning Conqueror, so her and all of the fairies that she makes, they're very cunning, and they use that cunning to, like, gain favor with your opponent's creatures, and now your opponent's creatures are so infatuated by their fairies that they will attack and go and kill the other players to protect the fairies. I think that it's so fun. It's a really, really cool commander to build around. And it's actually, I think that it's super easy to make this good with, like, just random bulk that you would have sitting around in your piles. Like, let alone building it as an actual, like, a good deck list. You could just, this is one of those commanders that's going to be good with just cards that you have lying around.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys mostly covered it. It's not oppressive in any way, really. It's just going to keep the game moving, which for a Demir commander, that's kind of a shock.
Yeah.
It's a fun, fair Demir commander. That's not supposed to be a thing.
If you guys remember the partner episode of our Commander gameplay series, I lent Tommy my Forced Combat deck, and I had this in the 99 of that deck. And I ended up making that deck. It originally was Grixis, and I changed it to be Izzet. This was the card that made it hardest for me. This was the card that was the hardest for me to say, but could I keep black in the deck? Because this card is just so cool. It's so fun. Do we play it at top of A? Or is that what we're feeling, or is that not fair?
I would rather play this than Ramos.
Sorry, Preston, what we got
Yeah,
next?
it's my turn. Well, that's good that it's my
Oh, yeah.
turn because up next we have Lord Windgrace. For two, a black, a red, and a green, you have a legendary Planeswalker, the first Planeswalker commander that we're going to be talking about. Windgrace is the Planeswalker type. His +2 is discard a card, then draw a card. If a land card is discarded this way, you draw an additional card. His -3 is return up to 2 target land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. And his -11 is destroy up to 6 target non-land permanents, then create 6 2/2 green cat warrior creature tokens with Force Walk. This guy's really strong. We put him all at B. Yep, we all put him at B, so makes sense. He's not oppressive by any means, but those first and second abilities are gonna get a lot of work done in almost every game you play.
Yeah. I think the thing that keeps it at a B for me is we saw it a decent amount. Preston used to have this deck. So I think just seeing it in action has kind of just been like, I don't really care if I see it anymore. But also, we just have so many land commanders. I think I like Jund as a land color combination, but I think at this point I'd prefer the other Windgrace, the Soul of Windgrace, or whatever the heck it's called from Dominaria United. But there's just so many options for land commanders. I just think land decks, I'm just kind of bored of them, if I'm being honest. I think I'm just kind of bored of land decks, and I also just think that it's a tad strong, and it just kind of says play lands, draw cards, play lands, draw cards, which it's hard to create a clock. I mean, that ultimate is definitely a clock, but it's also a planeswalker, and not that these planeswalker commanders aren't good. I definitely think they can be, but you can't rely on getting to the ultimate to help close out games. So I think it's mid. I think it's cool, but
He really doesn't care about his ultimate. I had that deck for a few years. I did his ultimate like 3 times, and
mhm.
it was like, yeah, okay, I'll do it, but it's the plus and minus abilities that make him so powerful.
Right.
And I mean, it's not like it's not in green, so it's not like you can't play like doubling season. I think that this card is a good commander because one of the cool things about planeswalkers that kind of just goes underrated, in my opinion, is the fact that your opponent's creatures can't swing at you if they want to deal with Lord Windgrace. Like it's almost like a second player and that's working for you in that point at that point because people are now swinging at your commander instead of swinging at you and dealing damage to you. So they're wasting their attacks on this. And I mean, being able to put it back in the command zone, you're going to be able to ramp out a ton because that's what the deck wants to do. So recasting Windgrace probably isn't going to be that bad. And being able to activate Windgrace once or twice, depending on what's going on in the game, could just be enough for what you need. It's really good with fetch lands. It's a good commander that's going to be able to bounce back against like the mass land destruction or the targeted land destruction. But I think that it's just a bit too strong and too like potentially oppressive for me to put it any higher than a B.
Sure.
Yeah, you can never really deal with Grace. Once he gets started, he will always have enough lands to come back on the next turn or two.
Potentially in the same turn.
Yeah. But here's one that we're a smidge higher on. What do we got next, Jason?
Next up, we got Kibo Uktabi Prince. I think I said that right. I don't know. For 2 and a green, it's a 2/2 Monkey Noble. It has tap. Each player creates a colorless artifact token named Banana. With tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 green or 1 red, you gain 2 life. And then it has whenever an artifact that opponent controls is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control that's an ape or a monkey. And then whenever Kibo attacks, defending player sacrifices an artifact. There's a lot of words on this card, for sure, but it doesn't take a genius to know what this is wanting to do. You want to, either swing with him and make your opponent sacrifice artifacts, or you want to give them bananas and then swing with them and make them sacrifice artifacts. It's just a really fun and interesting, like, I don't know. When I say interesting, I just love the art. I love like that first ability, like the idea of giving your opponents bananas and that they eat them to get some life back. It's very flavorful in that sense. I just talked about how I love flavor on cards. But then it's also actually a strong commander because whenever you're attacking, they're sacrificing artifacts. So playing this with a card like, Mycosynth Lattice that's going to make everything an artifact, you could really just do some nasty stuff with it that way. I think that this card is fun. So I gave it an A, Morgan gave it an A, and Preston gave it a B.
Yeah, so we're gonna put that sucker at the bottom of A. Yeah, talking about flavor, bananas. They got that flavor, man. They got that flavor. We talked a little bit about this card last episode in the podcast. Jason, I know you weren't here, but we were talking about the Uktabi saga. There's a series of cards here that must be represented. But it's just kind of funny to be like, monkey, and throwing bananas and just gain value off of, again, cards that you wouldn't necessarily play. Like, how many playable monkeys and apes are there in Magic? Some, there's Ragavans and stuff like that. But for the most part, you're just playing really goofy cards, and it's just kind of funny. But it can get very, very strong. I mean, there are other payoffs you can play as well for, like, when your opponents sacrifice an artifact, do this and stuff like that. So you could really lean heavily into that. I'm sure there's ways that you can amplify how many bananas you're giving people. There are artifacts and stuff that just let you untap your commander or whatever, so you could get multiple uses out of Kibo too, which is then going to get really scary when you have a decent army of monkey, and you can really start punching face with all those counters you're getting. And you're in green, so you can, doubling season and stuff like that, double the counter. So it's funny. but then it's also like Planet of the Apes kind of crap, and they're just going to take over. And I think it's actually pretty strong. I have played against it once. It is quite strong.
It's tribal, group hug, and group slug all in one card, and I really like that.
You were a little lower on it. Did you have anything you wanted to say about why that might be, or
I
just
it,
not your thing?
I don't dislike it. It's just, you know, it's not the most original card I've ever seen. It's got a nice flair to it I like. And I do sort of appreciate it continuing that story from those older cards from
I
what,
think you should bump it up to an
20
A,
years ago?
Preston.
You know what? Yeah, I'll give it an A.
Yeah, boy.
There we go.
It's still an A on the board,
I
but
I
thanks.
I like the
I,
monkey, but
I do agree that it's bottom tier of A for the cards that we have up there right now. But yeah, definitely an A in my opinion.
All right, well, let's see if we could speed through these last few cards so we can not go too far over the hour. Next up is a Nixia, Hand of Erebos. This is for 2 white, black, green, 4/4 Demigod. It's a legendary enchantment creature. It has Menace. Other enchantment creatures you control have Menace, and whenever it enters or attacks, exile up to 1 target non-aura enchantment card from your graveyard and create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 3/3 zombie in addition to its other types. So, we've talked about before how we all hate enchantment decks because they just spin in their wheels and they don't know how they win and it takes long turns and you don't know what they're doing. Nixia says, yeah, we're going to do some of that, but now our creatures have menace. We're reanimating our creatures. So now we're actually going to be able to start punching face and closing out the game. Preston played this on the Commander Masters episode of our gameplay series and put in a lot of impressive work. And I think he got to show both sides of that. I think he got to show off that, yes, you are going to do a lot of the same enchantment stuff of just a lot of value, but then you're actually going to have the means to close out the game much more efficiently than a lot of other enchantment decks. And having access to black actually lets you play a lot of cool enchantments. So we were all very high on it. I think we gave it all an A.
yeah. Yeah, I preferred the backup commander for that one, but this was still a very fun commander to play with. Like you can do a surprising amount of work with it. Like there are only 3/3s, but they have menace built in while your commander's out, so you're gonna deal some damage out of nowhere.
I just like the idea of putting a lot of enchantments into this deck that aren't creatures and then bringing them back as creatures so that you could use them as enchantments but also hit your opponents with them. Uh, and the menace, giving them that evasion, it is, hopefully going to be something that makes them easier to kill in combat so they can stay on the battlefield and you can keep getting use out of them while trying to take your opponents out. I think it's just an interesting card. 5 mana 4/4 with menace. That alone is pretty good. I actually really like that. Um, I don't really have much more to say about it than that. It's a good, solid card, solid commander.
Speaking of strong, aggressive, Preston, what do we got next?
All right, next up we have Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. For 1, a red, a green, and a white, 5/4 cat demon. Creatures you control get +1/+0 and have vigilance as long as you control 3 or more creatures. Creatures you control also get +1/+0 and have trample as long as you control 6 or more creatures. And then finally, creatures you control get +1/+0 and have double strike as long as you control 9 or more creatures. Let's see. We all gave this guy a B. He looks really fun when you first read him, but when people start playing him, he's kind of oppressive in a lot of metas.
Yeah, it's board wipe check up high because you could just play it fairly, like just play value creatures, and even then, I think it's still pretty good. But the most common thing I see with Jetmir is you're playing tokens and you're going wide, or even like not even tokens, but you just play a bunch of efficient like 1 and 2 mana creatures, and then you build up super fast. And if you do go with the tokens, you are in green and you're in white, so you have access to a lot of the token doublers. You're in red, so you have impact tremors and stuff like that. It's closing out games very
Haste enablers.
It's closing out games so incredibly fast. You really need
multiple combats.
You really need the board wipes. It's Yeah. It's very strong, but it's also kind of boring. Like if you want to play this color combination, either play aggressive or play tokens, it's hard to not play this.
I mean, it's token. It's probably the best token commander that there is. Um, it's Naya. I mean, that's just a good go wide creature's colors. Um, and because it's in white, you're gonna have those Teferi's protections, like those types of
True.
effects. Now that like Bloom, I forget what the one in Bloomburrow is, where like you give your opponent an extra turn.
Dawn's Truce.
And then there's Dawn's Hope, where it
Oh,
gives you
yeah,
stuff
that's it.
indestructible. No, Dawn's Hope is the one that gives you stuff indestructible.
Yeah.
There's I can't remember the one where your stuff
Perch
it's
protection.
like basically yes. Um, it's just it's good, but board wipes do kind of take care of this deck. And then it's similar to Finn in the instance of like Jetmir's the problem, and once you get Jetmir off the table, like all of these tokens are probably just really small 1/1s, and you're not probably going to be very scared of them.
Well, yeah, I think Jetmir is the strongest general token commander, but there might be a few who specify what kind of tokens that you want to play with that might be a little better,
Yeah, that's true.
like some of the elves or the merfolk.
Yeah, that's true. We got a couple left. Jason, what do we got next?
Next up, we have Marchesa, the Black Rose. For 1 red, 1 black, 1 blue, and 1, it's a 3/3 human wizard with Dethrone. That's whenever this creature attacks the player with the most life or tied for the most life, it gets a +1/+1 counter. And then other creatures you control have Dethrone. And whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, return that card to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. So we all gave this A's across the board. I think that this is just a fantastic commander. The fact that you can trigger that last ability on anybody's turn by sacrificing a creature, have it come back at their end step, and get an ETB trigger of some sorts, and then be able to do it again on the next player's turn. If you have those cards that make it enter with a +1/+1 counter, that's really good. So something like Persist is going to be really, really powerful in Marchesa, because those are going to balance out, and as long as you're able to put the +1/+1 counters back on them, like as long as you're able to put two +1/+1 counters on them, one to cancel out the -1 from the Persist, and then one to have the +1 on there to meet the Marchesa requirement. You can have a lot of fun with this deck and do a lot of really cool and interesting things with it. It's also one of those conspiracy cards, and those cards are sweet. They're really powerful, and I think that I like Marchesa a lot.
It's
One of the things I
aggressive.
really like about it is
Go ahead,
that,
Preston.
it does the aggressive. I was gonna. So it does the aggressive thing of like swinging at your opponents. It wants the game to go on, but some of those commanders kind of want you to build up a little fortress for yourself and keep your own life total up. You can't do that with Marchesa. You need to keep your life total down too. So you got to play a little risky with her. You want to play those red and black effects that, you use your life for stuff. Otherwise, you're not going to get you to throne to happen. So I really do like that. It really is making everyone get closer to the end game, which is pretty rare for some of these aggressive commanders. So I do like that.
Yep. Yeah, you guys got it. We'll throw that up in A. It's aggressive. It forces you to play a little risky. It's resilient. It's in a cool color combination. I like it a lot. Next up, we have Shelob, Child of Ungoliant. This is a Lord of the Rings commander for 4 black and a green. It's an 8/8 spider demon with Death Touch and Ward 2. Welcome to the Age of Power Creep. Other spiders you control have Death Touch and Ward 2. And then whenever another creature dealt damage this turn by a spider you control dies, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a food artifact. So that means you can pay 2, tap it, sacrifice this artifact, you gain 3 life, and it loses all other card types. So I actually had this deck for a while and thought it was fine. I have it here as a B Preston also has it as a B. Jason has it as an A. So it's going to average out to a B. We'll put it in like middle of B, I guess. And I think most people just play it as Spider Tribal, which I think is fine. You know, it's giving a good stats to your other spiders. And then if people are blocking and stuff, then you're getting extra value. What I did was I ran a handful of other spiders in the deck, but I mostly would hope to get Shelob out, give Shelob some kind of protection, and then play fight spells. And that way I could pick and choose, and I was like the spider waiting for its prey to come and then attacking the prey. Like that was like the play style I was going for. And it was fun, but it was very situational. Like how often do you really care to have that effect from your opponent? Because you're not really getting like big bodies when you do that. You're just getting enter the battlefield, statics. And yes, there's lots of those in Commander, but it is very situational as to when this sucker actually strikes. So I think if you're playing a spider typal, good for you, go for it. But if you're doing what I did, it's more interesting but less powerful. But overall, I think in either of those situations, I think it's just meh. I think it's fine. So B.
See, I put this as an A for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's a bit stronger than you're thinking because you're not thinking about like activated abilities. You could steal somebody's Heart of the Wilds,
had the deck.
And now you're making 8 mana. So, just saying.
Yeah. No. There's crazy things you could do with it, but it's situational. You have to hope that your opponents have no idea what you're doing, and you have to hope that they just play into it.
Okay. The other thing about it is this is another one of those cards that is just right on the money with the flavor, dude. It's right on the money with the flavor. You're turning the creatures that you deal damage to. So, like, Shelob injects them with her venom. They just become immobilized, and she wraps them up in the web, and then she eats them later. It's literally the perfect flavor for a Lord of the Rings card like this, and that's why I absolutely love it. Absolutely had to give it an A. Shelob had the ring for a second there. Think about it. She had the ring. Not that she knew what to do with it or cared, but she had the ring for a moment.
It's true.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine. I think it's a little high effort, low reward sometimes, depending on what you're playing against. But I don't dislike it, you know. I'm glad spiders have a good tribal commander because people wanted one of those for a while, I feel like. Because there were not a lot of great spiders, but people still liked them.
There were some pretty okay spider commanders, but nothing too. Because there
I
was
think
the
only
one
other good
from-
one was the Delirium one from Eldritch Moon. I think that was the only other decent one, wasn't it?
I feel like there was another. I feel like there was another Golgari one that maybe came out in like
I think one of those Ravnica blocks had a okay Gogari spider.
I feel like there was one that was like later than that. I don't know. Hang on, let me see. Well, I guess I can. Never mind.
Well, we got one left in our tier list for part 1 of this series. Preston, close us out with our last card of the day.
All right. Finally, we have Liesa, Shroud of Dusk, two white and a black for a 5/5 angel. Rather than pay 2 generic for each previous time you've cast this spell from the command zone this game, pay 2 life that many times. Then it has flying and lifelink, and whenever I play a cast spell, they lose 2 life. This is another commander that wants to end the game pretty quickly by making people lose life, but we all rated this one a lot lower than some of those other ones. Me and Morgan have it C, Jason has it at D.
I feel like I like playing with your life. I like doing that because it's in Commander. You have so much life to start off with. It lets you play some of the riskier cards, and it has lifelink. So if it gets to stick around, get some swings. It's a 5/5 flyer with lifelink. I mean, you might be able to stabilize pretty well with it. I feel like this way of getting around Commander tax is also pretty good. The problem is people don't like stacks. and this is the worst stacks imaginable. So it's a double whammy in the fact that it's going to draw hate from the table while not actually doing a good job at slowing your opponents, because 2 damage per spell is not enough to keep people at bay, unless it's like literally a storm deck. If it's literally a storm deck, then sure. But for the most part, I think it looks scarier than it and it's going to draw more hate than it's actually putting effort into the game. So that's why I'm so low on it.
I just don't like the design of this card. I just don't like it. I think that the paying 2 life instead of the commander tax is interesting. But it being a 5/5 flyer with lifelink, I don't know that that's necessarily good enough for 5 mana where it's going to make you lose life as well when you play spells. I just don't really care for the design of this card. I don't like it very much.
Yeah, it's not going to slow down anyone but Storm or people who are playing like a bunch of little stuff that probably aren't that threatening. So like it's good to hit the Storm players, but the people who are just playing a bunch of little stuff, like you're going to do a ton of damage to them, even though they're probably not all that scary. And then the person who's playing one Eldrazi a turn is like, okay, I'll take 2. Who cares? I'm winning the game regardless.
Right. And also, how often do you see Storm anyways?
Yeah. Especially nowadays, I feel like people have just kind of gotten sick of it.
Yeah. So we're going to go ahead and put this at the bottom of C, but above Light Paws, because, we have to. All right. And we're going to take a screenshot of this to use for the thumbnail later. And that is it, guys. That is our tier list for commanders number 100 through, I don't know, 81. No, 80. I don't know. We looked at the top. This is part 1 of 5 of reacting to the top 100 commanders according to EDH Rec. So if you want to see us continue this, we'll get back to doing this in a couple of weeks. We have a couple other topics we're going to hit first. But yeah, that's it. That's the end of the episode. I'm really good at closing this out. I'm really good at functioning when I'm low on energy. We'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.